So one of the most useful models that I have, and at this point, 2003, right? So it's coming up on what, 20 years old at this point next year. And I every now and then I say, this thing is old. Should I keep going back to it? And I keep coming back to it because I haven't found anything else that to me is as practical and helpful as we think about the structure of our classes than this model is. And so I share this as a way to help us think concretely about how we might, again, move towards more equitable engagement for students in our classes. So this 4-stage model starts with creating an environment for dialogue. The goal here is to create the conditions conducive for dialogues to occur. Next, we situate the dialogue. Then we explore conflicts in multiple perspectives. And then we move from dialogue to action. I'm going to talk through each of these stages and give some examples around this notion of equitable environments. So let me just give a brief background on intergroup dialogue. So intergroup dialogues is a process for engaging people in dialogues about difficult topics. They're intergroup dialogue because the whole goal here is that they bring two groups together that have some tension or conflict as a way to explore the sources of conflict and then find tangible ways to engage in dialogue towards the goal of newfound understanding, right? So if we think about our society right now, many of us would agree that we are living in a society that is very, very divisive, right? Where folks really don't engage with each other. Like the whole goal, when you look at MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, any of the major news stations, is they bring people on for a 7 or 8 minute segment. One side believes this, the other side believes that. They share their perspective, and then they engage in debate to prove why my opponent is flawed and why my perspective is the one that's correct, right? Intergroup dialogue is saying that the whole goal here is around sustained dialogue, is to come to newfound understanding through this 4-stage process. And if we think about the course of a semester, so I teach a class that is 15 weeks. We meet one time a week for 2 hours and 45 minutes each week. And so I think of my class structured through this 4-stage intergroup dialogue format. So let's talk through what this might look like. So stage 1, creating an environment for dialogue. So the whole goal of this first stage is to create the conditions for the dialogue that we want to happen to occur. So we have to do certain things to set up the space so that it can occur. So if our goal is to have students, again, develop critical thinking skills or learn to interact with their peers across differences, then we have to create the conditions for that to occur. So one thing that might happen in this stage is to think through some lower risk activities that help students build relationships with each other. So I'll give my class as an example. So I'm in this class where the whole goal, again, is to help students understand how to facilitate and engage in dialogues about difficult topics. So one of the activities that I have students do during the second week of the semester is I call it a stories in the box activity. And I ask students to bring 3 items to class to share with each other. One of those items should reflect a dominant identity that they hold. Another item should reflect a minoritized or subordinated identity that they hold. And then the third item can reflect any identity of their choosing. And they use this as a way to introduce themselves to each other. And again, it's a lower risk activity intended to help them build trust with each other and get comfortable talking about their identities. Because for many of them, this is the first space that they really have to think about, like, what does it mean to be, for example, a white woman in this space? Or what does it mean to be an international student in this space? Or to be a Black student who also identifies as heterosexual, right? So to get comfortable talking about the importance of those identities with them is, again, a way to build some trust with each other. So for me as an instructor, if I'm thinking about your classes, the things I would think about are, think about who is in your class. The whole reason I asked you to draw your classroom at the start was because I wanted you to envision your class in this space, to think about the demographics of your students, to think about who you are as an educator, and then what might you contribute as an instructor. So in the course of a 15-week semester, I usually spend about 3 or 4 weeks on stage 1, because again, I've noticed if I don't spend the time to help students build trust, then the kinds of dialogue that I want them to engage in doesn't happen because they haven't spent the necessary time getting to know each other in these more lower risk ways. So that's stage one, creating an environment for dialogue. The second stage then is situating the dialogue. So in this stage, you've now spent the time building trust with students in your classes. So now you're asking them to engage in more risky activity, right? So you've spent some time with the more lower risk activity, and now we're trying to help them understand and develop more trust with each other, and then to also then be able to like, know the topics that they're going to be talking about in this class. So I might include the key terms that are relevant in your field. So hopefully you've seen me trying to model some of this today as well too, right? So I started off with introducing myself a bit so that you got to know me more. That was more lower risk for me. And then I am asking you to think about the key terms that I'm using throughout today's session, right? So similarly, I introduce key terms to students in my classes. Another thing you might do here is to use caucus groups. So caucus groups means that you're bringing together people who have shared identities to engage with each other before bringing them to heterogeneous groups. So sometimes it's really important, for example, around the topic of race, for white people, white students to have space talking with only white students before they interact with their peers of color. Because there are certain things that white students have to have experience talking about with just among themselves. And sometimes students of color also just want the space to be able to talk about issues of race without feeling like they have to do that with white students present. So this is why caucus groups are often important, is because folks can talk about the issues that are relevant to their identity, and then you bring them together in larger cross-racial groups. So some examples here on my slide here is one of the things I noticed when I was prepping for the talk is around your mission, vision, and core values is this focus on inclusivity, right? Value the unique skills, experiences, and identities of each person, continuously improving how we involve, develop, empower, and trust one another. So because this is tied to our mission and values, some key questions here are, to what extent is this mission reflected in your courses, right? Whose voices are heard? Who makes the important decisions in your courses? Who are in the senior leadership positions at the institution, right? Is this value really reflected? So stage two, you're really asking participants to do some digging around some of the things we believe and see the extent to which that's actually happening in practice. This you also might spend about 4 or 5 weeks on stage two before you get to this point around exploring conflicts and multiple perspectives. So now you've built some trust with the group. You've also done some time caucusing, you've done some time exploring the key terms in your discipline. And so now you're gonna just take some more time to dig into those issues that might create some tension or conflict, right? So some topics right now that are really important in our society, right? There's courses at the Supreme Court around affirmative action, right? This comes up every few years, right? We just had in our Senate, they passed, a resolution around same-sex marriage, right? So these are really critical issues that are happening in our society, and they're hot topics, meaning that there's lots of different feelings around these topics in our society. So what are the hot topics in your field, in your profession, in your discipline that you want students to really engage around, right? And so you might ask them some key questions around that to help prompt their thinking around those issues. Then we get to the last stage here, which is moving from dialogue to action. So here you might identify a core issue to tackle further, right? You might also think about what does action look like. As an example here, I mentioned that I teach primarily graduate students, but when I was at Miami University, I did spend 2 years teaching a UNV 101 class, a University 101 class, which was a newly designed class for all first-year students at Miami, where they were supposed to take a class together, multiple sections, right? Around 20 students in each of these sections, designed to help them transition into being college students. I vividly remember that towards the end of this class, like each of the students was to talk about something that they were going to do, some action step that they were going to take beyond this class to keep their learning happening. So I asked students to share with me what their action item was. One of the students raised his hand and said, one of the things I really want to do in this class or after this class is I have this really close friend that I've known since we were like 6 years old. And this friend often tells racist jokes in front of me. And I often feel very uncomfortable when he's sharing this with me, and I never know what to do. So I've decided as a result of this class, the next time that this happens, I'm going to tell my friend that's not okay, and here's why, right? And one of the students in the class said something to the extent of, well, that's not really like, what's the big deal about that, right? That feels very small to me. And to me, like I push back on that because the goal here is not to judge the smallness or significance of the action, but it's really to get participants to do something tangible that they can take with them and say, oh, yes, I've done this as a result of this class. So to me, that's what's critical here in stage 4, is not to weigh the significance of the action, but is to actually think about what can we do beyond this space. So again, stage 1 is creating an environment for dialogue. Then we move towards situating the dialogue, exploring conflicts in multiple perspectives, and then moving from dialogue to action.